I'm Laura Trevelyan at the United Nations in New York, and this is a special edition of BBC World News America. World leaders are gathering here as the conflict in Ukraine may be about to escalate. French President Emmanuel Macron condemns what he calls Russian imperialism as parts of Ukraine under Moscow's control say they'll hold snap referenda on joining Russia. Turkey's President Erdogan calls for a dignified way out of the Ukraine crisis and appears to offer himself as a mediator. Meanwhile, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says the world is facing a winter of discontent.
A cost of living crisis is raging, trust is crumbling, inequalities are exploding, and our planet is burning.
And much of Puerto Rico remains without power after the full force of Hurricane Fiona battered the island, killing 2 people. Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. The atmosphere here on Manhattan's east side is one of heightened political urgency and renewed in-person diplomacy. After a quiet few years due to the pandemic, world leaders have been arriving here en masse, one by one right past me here at the entrance to UN headquarters. They're nearly united in calling for a negotiated peaceful end to the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, thousands of miles from here, officials in Russian-controlled areas in the east and south of Ukraine have announced a series of snap referenda on joining Russia. The US and its allies have been quick to condemn this move by the Kremlin, with the French president calling the referendum plans a parody. Well, joining us now to put the day's events into perspective is Stéphane Dujarric, who is the spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General. Welcome to the programme, Stéphane.
Thank you, Laura. Nice to see you again.
So, Kremlin proxies are saying that they will hold referenda in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. This is happening as world leaders here are calling for a negotiated end to the conflict. Isn't this going to escalate it, these referenda? Stéphane Dujarric, spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, Russia has suffered a series of setbacks on the battlefield in Ukraine recently, in areas newly liberated by Ukrainian forces. Disturbing accounts of torture by Russian soldiers are continuing to emerge. Our senior international correspondent, Ula Gerin, reports now from the city of Izium, a warning that Ula's report contains some distressing testimony. Well, for more on the war in Ukraine and the response of the West, I was joined here this morning by America's ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. And tomorrow, President Biden will address the UN General Assembly. Now, much of Puerto Rico remains without power after Hurricane Fiona battered the region, leaving 80% of homes and businesses in the dark. Fiona hit Puerto Rico on Sunday, causing an island-wide outage for its 1.5 million customers as power lines were damaged. Generators have been powered up, but the full restoration of power could take several days. We can speak now with Victor Ramos Rosado, a journalist with El Nuevo Dia, who's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Thanks so much for joining us. And can you just tell us, Victor, about the scale of the damage there on Puerto Rico? Victor Ramos Rosado, thank you so much for joining us there from Puerto Rico.
Thank you for having me.
Well, winds of up to 185 kilometres an hour are now lashing the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean as Hurricane Fiona bears down on the British territory's main island. Earlier, the hurricane hit the Dominican Republic, where flash floods are still affecting the country, with 3 eastern provinces being declared disaster zones. In Japan, rescue teams are warning of the danger of mudslides following continued heavy rain brought by Typhoon Nanmadol. At least 4 people have been killed by what has been described as one of the most powerful storms to hit Japan for several decades. Hundreds of thousands of homes are without power, and forecasters say some areas can expect up to 30 centimetres of rain in a single day. Well, severe weather has been a preoccupation here at the United Nations, where many world leaders have mentioned the impact of climate change. But it has been a dramatic day here at the UN. Things will seem to be even more so on Wednesday. President Biden is going to take the podium. He couldn't speak today because he was at Queen Elizabeth's funeral yesterday. And Liz Truss will be making her debut here as the Prime Minister of Britain. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will be delivering a speech via video. He had to get special permission for that because it's an in-person meeting. Meanwhile, in some potential counter-programming, President Vladimir Putin is expected to deliver a speech of his own on those referenda we were talking about in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. I'm Laura Trevelyan. Thank you so much for watching this special edition of BBC World News America.
This week has seen a chill develop across central and eastern parts of Europe, with temperatures 3 to 5 degrees below average.
You're live with Lucy Hockings on BBC World News.
I'm Laura Trevelyan at the United Nations here in New York City with a special edition of World News America. President Biden accuses Russia of violating the UN Charter with its invasion of Ukraine. Here at the United Nations today, Mr. Biden accused President Putin of making irresponsible nuclear threats, and he delivered a firm rebuke of Russia's war against Ukraine.
Putin claims he had to act because Russia was threatened. But no one threatened Russia, and no one other than Russia sought conflict.
Meanwhile, President Putin announced his plans to call up 300,000 reservists to help its military campaign in Ukraine. New York's Attorney General files a civil suit against Donald Trump and 3 of his children, accusing them of fraud. The former president condemns the lawsuit as a witch hunt. And we look at the fall from grace of the former president of Honduras, now accused of drug running and weapons smuggling. Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. Vladimir Putin isn't coming to the UN General Assembly, but his impact is being felt. The Russian president's mobilization of reserve forces and the Kremlin's move to annex parts of Ukraine are being seen here as an escalation of the 7-month-old conflict. In a televised address Wednesday, President Putin accused the West of occupying Ukraine and engaging in nuclear blackmail before threatening to use nuclear weapons. Here at the United Nations today, President Biden countered by saying Russia violated the UN Charter with its invasion. The US president also accused Mr. Putin of making irresponsible nuclear threats. Ukraine's fight back against Russia is being supported by the NATO military alliance. NATO's eastward expansion and Ukraine's desire to join the alliance are 2 of the things which so aggravated President Putin and were factors behind his invasion. For more on where this 7-month-old conflict is going, I spoke to the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, here at the United Nations. The NATO Secretary General there, who can't quite see as yet how this war is going to end. In other news now, street protests in Iran over the death of a woman in custody have spread to more towns and cities. 9 people, including a policeman, have been killed. Mahsa Amini's family say she was attacked after being arrested by the so-called morality police, while they claim she died of natural causes. Protests against her death have also been held here at the United Nations in New York and in Canada and in Turkey. The US Central Bank has raised interest rates by another 0.75% to its highest level in 14 years as it tries to rein in soaring prices in the world's largest economy. The Federal Reserve hiked its benchmark rate, which affects many consumer and business loans, to a range of 3 to 3.25%. Now to matters concerning former President Donald Trump. The Attorney General of New York State has filed a civil suit against Mr. Trump and 3 of his children, accusing them of fraud. The Trumps are said to have lied to lenders and insurers about the value of assets held by the Trump Organization, the family business. Mr. Trump has denied any wrongdoing. For more, let's go across town to Trump Tower here in New York City and speak to the BBC's Neda Tawfiq. So, Neda, what exactly is Mr. Trump said to have done to the value of Trump Tower and his other marquee properties, and why? Neda Tawfiq at Trump Tower, thank you. We turn now to accusations of corruption against the former president of Honduras. Juan Orlando Hernandez is due to appear in court here in New York before the end of the month, in the first stage of his trial for drug smuggling and weapons charges. It's a spectacular fall from grace for the former ally of Washington, who's accused of running a narco state and accepting huge bribes from a drug lord. Mr. Hernandez denies any wrongdoing. Our Central America correspondent Will Grant reports from Honduras. China's leader Xi Jinping will not be coming to the UN this week, though he's looking ahead to China's Communist Party Congress in a few weeks, which is due to usher in his historic third term in office. That comes amid considerable pressure on the country's massive economy. Beijing's zero COVID strategy is a big part of this. Strict measures remain in place to return each outbreak of the virus to no new cases. Our China correspondent Stephen McDonald's report starts on the outskirts of Beijing. Now, before we go, let's return to our top story and put today's events here at the United Nations into perspective. For that, we're joined by our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette. And Lise, we heard President Biden here today. Did you think he was really trying to rally the world behind his cause of supporting Ukraine against Russia? Lise Doucette, the BBC's chief international correspondent, thank you so much for joining us. So, an extremely eventful day here at the United Nations, really dominated by President Putin speaking in Moscow and announcing that he's calling up reservists. Everything that Russia does is reverberating here through the United Nations, and President Biden actually accusing Russia of violating the UN Charter. Thank you so much for watching this special edition of BBC World News America from the UN General Assembly.
Hello there. Let's take a look at the weather prospects for the coming days across Europe. So here is the satellite picture showing us
we'll not see our lives dominated by it.
Trevelyan at the United Nations in New York City with a special edition of World News America. Russia's foreign minister defends Moscow's war in Ukraine at a fraught meeting here at the UN. The US Secretary of State said Moscow should not be allowed to trample on the rules of international law.
The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it.
Russia's foreign minister claimed that it was Ukraine who were the aggressors in this war.
There's an attempt today to impose on us a completely different narrative about Russian aggression as the origin of all the tragedy.
Meanwhile, the mobilization of 300,000 Russian military reservists has begun, with reports that anti-war protesters are also being drafted. And in Iran, unrest in 80 towns and cities, sparked by the death of a woman detained by the morality police. Her father says they lied about how she died.
I asked them why you didn't transfer her to the hospital earlier, and they said the ambulance's key was lost for 20 minutes and they couldn't find it. Can you believe this?
Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. The stakes were high, the words were sharp, and the atmosphere was tense here at the UN today as top diplomats from the US, Ukraine and Russia traded blame for the war in Ukraine. At a meeting of the UN Security Council, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was only in the chamber during his own speech and defended Russia's actions. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and America's allies took turns blaming Vladimir Putin for the war, with America's top diplomat saying that one man chose this war, one man can end it. Mr. Blinken took particular aim at the timing of the Kremlin's mobilization plans, which could add hundreds of thousands of troops to Russia's war effort. Ukraine is claiming that these recent battlefield successes, even if they are fragile, directly helped achieve the biggest prisoner of war swap to date with Russia. Officials said several Russian soldiers were captured during the counter-offensive in the northeast, and this was why over 100 fighters from Ukraine's Azov brigade had been exchanged. The Ukrainian tycoon Viktor Medvedchuk, President Vladimir Putin's top ally in Kyiv, was also released. Well, so many developments, so much to talk about when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. The US has been trying to keep a close watch on these developments. So for more, I spoke to the White House National Security spokesman, retired Admiral John Kirby, here at the United Nations. Well, let's turn to those dramatic events in Iran now. Protesters have fought running battles with police in the capital, Tehran, as demonstrations over the death of a young woman in police custody continue for a seventh day. Internet access has been severely restricted in a bid to stop the unrest from spreading. In a rare interview with foreign media, the woman's father has contradicted the authorities' version of events about how she died. Raha Rahimpour from the BBC's Persian service now reports. Well, in response to the death of Mahsa Amini and the crackdown on the protests that followed, the US has imposed sanctions on Iran's morality police. Joining me now to talk about all of this is BBC Persian's correspondent here in New York, Bahman Kalbasi. Welcome to the programme, Bahman, here at the United Nations. Now, this was President Raisi's first visit to the UN. But has his handling of the protests and of the death of Mahsa Amini just underlined his reputation as a hardliner? Bahman Kalbasi, thank you so much for that analysis there. Now, the shocking murder of a young woman in South Korea last week has led to widespread anger there after it highlighted the country's weak laws on stalking. The man suspected of stabbing the subway worker had been stalking her for many years and was actually due to be sentenced the very next day. Politicians have been criticised for not taking violence against women seriously enough. Our Seoul correspondent, Jean McKenzie, reports. And before we go tonight, let's update you on a day of high-stakes diplomacy here at the United Nations. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov defended Russia's actions in Ukraine at a meeting of the UN Security Council and instead placed the blame on Kyiv. For his part, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken pointed the finger squarely at Russia, saying President Putin has shown contempt for the United Nations Charter by adding more fuel to the fire he started. It was a very tense session following a dramatic series of days here at the United Nations General Assembly General Debate. Events in Ukraine, thousands of miles from here, are the backdrop for this meeting, the biggest event in the diplomatic calendar. But there is no sign at all of that war in Ukraine ending or of a diplomatic solution. I'm Laura Trevelyan. Thank you for watching this special edition of BBC World News America.
It's turned much cooler across central and eastern parts of Europe this week,